Salvete discipuli. So, today's video is the third and final lesson in Chapter 4 in Latin for the New Millennium, Volume 2. And we're going to learn one more of the subjunctive subordinate clauses. And we're going to um, complete our idea of the sequence of tenses. Sorry. So I know we've kind of done the sequence of tenses before, but that was before we knew the perfect and pluperfect subjunctive. So now we need to talk about the sequence of tenses as they pertain to how you say things in the past, okay? Okay, but first, let's learn this new subjunctive subordinate clause. It is called indirect question. Now, you guys are somewhat familiar with an indirect way of saying something, right? Because forever now you've been translating the indirect statement. The indirect statement, however, is a construction that uses infinitives, whereas indirect question is set up as a subordinate clause using the subjunctive. Okay, so to have an indirect question, you need to have a question word and a verb in the subjunctive. Okay, question words like quis, who, what, quid, what, qui, qui, quod, which is the interrogative adjective. So, what monster is hiding under my bed? Or, I don't know. Let me look around the room. What girl doesn't understand Latin? So on and so forth. Quando, when, quam, how, cur, why, unde, from where, uter, so on and so forth. I do want to point out quam is new in this chapter, quam, how, and quantas, quanta, quantum, which is also a new vocab word. How big or how much or something along those lines. Okay, so how do you translate an indirect question? Well, you're going to translate it based on whatever the question word that sets up the indirect question is. Okay, so I know why the caged bird sings. That's an indirect question within the title. I wonder when my friend will get here. All of these are indirect questions. I'm not saying, when will my friend get here? I'm saying, I wonder when my friend will get here, okay? I'm going to point something out to you. And your textbook does not make any mention of this, but I just want you guys to know it. Have it in your notes and know it. Sometimes when you have an indirect question, Latin will use something called the future active periphrastic. Now, I know that sounds super impressive and long or whatever, but since what it actually means is that this is a way of asking an indirect question in the future when we don't have a future subjunctive. In order to do this kind of periphrastic or walking, kind of walking around, or saying around, I should say, you use a future active participle and then the subjunctive of the verb sum to ask an indirect question in the future. I wonder where my new house will be, so on and so forth. So there you go. Okay, actually, I'm going to go ahead and look at the sequence of tenses, and then we're going to go back and look at some examples of the indirect question, because I want to be able to show you examples of the indirect question employing the sequence of tenses, so we can sort of get practice at both of these. Now, we've already talked about the indirect question once. Basically, with the sequence of tenses once. Basically, the sequence of tenses dictates what tense of the subjunctive you can have in a subjunctive subordinate clause. And the ones you know so far are purpose clause and indirect question, okay? We have two sequences. There is primary sequence and secondary sequence, which is sometimes called historical sequence. A sentence will be in primary sequence if the main verb in the main clause is present, future, or future perfect. So if your verb in the main clause is present, future, or future perfect, you can only have one of two tenses in the purpose or the indirect question, the purpose clause, indirect question, or any of the other ones you'll be learning soon. You can have a present subjunctive that tells you that the action of the subordinate clause happened at the same time as the main clause, or you can have a perfect subjunctive saying that the action of the subordinate clause happened before the action of the main clause. If we're in historical sequence, meaning that the verb in the main sentence is imperfect, perfect, or pluperfect, you can have an imperfect subjunctive to show that the two clauses happened at the same time, or you can have a pluperfect subjunctive to show that the action of the subordinate clause happened before the action of the main clause, okay? And that's just the sequence of tenses. We'll get some practice figuring out which tense of the subjunctive should be used in the subordinate clause in class, but just make sure that you know what the sequence of tenses is. Okay, let's go back to some practice on the indirect question. One thing I want to point out is that indirect questions, like indirect statements, tend to be set up by head verbs, okay? But they don't have to be set up by a word like I ask or you ask. An indirect question can be set up by any number of verbs, any number of the head verbs that you know. So I want to look at a couple of these examples. Let's look at this first one. Rogant quando familia mea perveniat. So I am going to go over these sentences and how to translate them. You should be writing that down, even though I don't have it on the screen. You know, make sure you're listening and taking notes accordingly. Okay, here we have, and I'm going to show you how. Let me get my pen ready. Here we have an indirect question. We have our question word, when, right here, right? We have our verb in the subjunctive here, perveniat. So they ask when the subject of perveniat's familia mea, my family, perveniat, arrives. So we have the indirect question because we have our question word setting up a subjunctive subordinate clause. Here's our subjunctive verb. We know we're going to translate it. They ask when my family arrives because perveniat is present. So this happens at the same time as the asking. In this next sentence, we have quando again, but we have perveneret. We have the perfect subjunctive. So according to the sequence of tenses, we have a present verb in the main sentence. So we have a perfect subjunctive telling us that this happened before the asking, right? So they ask when my family arrived, okay? This next sentence, intelleximus cur hoc faceres. Okay, so here the verb in our main sentence is perfect, right? Intelleximus is perfect, right? So we understood cur, why faceres, you did hoc this. Now, we understood why you did this. We are translating faceres as a perfect, even though it's an imperfect subjunctive, because we know the imperfect subjunctive in secondary sequence, which this is because this is a perfect tense, so we're in a secondary sequence, tells us that the doing is happening at the same time as the understanding. So we understood why you did this. As opposed to this next example where we have the pluperfect subjunctive. We understood why you did this or why you had done this. Okay? This is one of those examples of the future active paraphrastic. So we have the future active participle plus, because we're in we're in secondary sequence, we're going to use the imperfect of the verb to be. We understood why you would do this. Okay. Okay, and our last example, sketus, present, so we're in primary sequence. You know who is able to save the city. You know quis patuerit, who was able to save the city. And in this last example, again, we have another example of the future active paraphrastic. You know who will save the city. Okay. Okay. Um, that's about it for now. Take good notes. Make sure you write down the different translations because we did all of these different indirect questions paying attention to the sequence of tenses so that you could get practice with both. And I will see you in class. Valete.